Okay, I think it's time to begin, although we do have a lot of people still logging on. So this webinar is originating from the city of Vancouver, which is founded on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Some speakers will also be presenting from other locations today, and we respectfully acknowledge those traditional territories. Hi, my name is Sophie King. I am the Manager of Professional Learning at PIBC, and welcome to PLN webinar number 4. We are very happy to welcome our speakers today, Jens von Bergman, founder and president of Mountain Math, and Heather Kauer, Director of Community Planning at the City of Abbotsford. So a very warm welcome to both our speakers. Sorry, a lot of people are still logging on. Okay. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to both the webinar recording and the slide presentation will be sent. No, we won't send it to you this time. We will put it on our website in the resource section, and you are welcome to refer to it at any time shortly after this webinar airs. And then a short word about the Q&A. Following all the presentations, participants will engage in the moderated Q&A session, focusing on housing needs reports. We have asked everyone who registered for this webinar to pre-submit 2 questions for the discussion, and as such, the Q&A will primarily focus on these previously submitted questions. If we do have time at the end, I'm very open to welcoming other questions that you might have submitted via the chat window in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Okay, so we will go on to our first presenter, Jens von Bergman of Mountain Math Software Analytics. Jens, please turn on your webcam and your mic and join us. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I will try to give an overview over housing needs assessment and targets. And what I want to do here is really start by looking at take more of a theoretical background approach to this and think about what are housing targets actually good for? How should we approach them sort of from a theoretical level? And I'm going to focus a little bit less on the concrete requirements that we have in BC on how to do this, but really just try to fill in some background around it and also talk about some alternative ways of how to assess targets that might be useful for people as they're looking at housing need in their community, related or unrelated specifically to the BC requirements. So to start out, what problem are these housing need reports and targets trying to fix? And I think it's important to understand this. And really, the main part here is we have a housing shortage. And I'll talk a little bit about more what that means. But the overall guiding questions for this presentation will be, how much overall housing do we actually need? Like, how much is our shortage? And then also, how much non-market housing or cash supports do we need to ensure everybody has access to housing? So starting from this premise, I want to talk a little bit about what does it mean to have enough housing or not enough housing? And the answer really is it depends, and that's reflected in our discussions about this and large disagreements of whether we should have more housing or not, and what shape or form this should take. It really depends on your perspective on this. So if you're a potential renter or buyer and you can't find what you're looking for roughly in the community, maybe near jobs or schools or things that you're interested in and that you can afford, then probably there isn't enough housing. If you can find it, then maybe there's just about the right amount. But also, in what cases do we think maybe there is too much housing? And that comes in if you're probably already comfortably housed, but you're really concerned about change in your neighborhood. Or maybe the rising home prices is something that you think is a fringe benefit, really, and not so much of a problem. So the point that I'm trying to make here is it's a values question, whether we have enough housing or not. And it's really important, I think, that we make these values, underlying values, explicit when we think about them in terms of housing needs and reports. They are encoded in there anyway, in some way, and just being very clear about this, I think, helps focus us on the task at hand. So I want to put my cards on the table here. So I think I somewhat controversially would say that the values that I'll assume in this talk is that housing is good, actually. People derive tremendous value from living in housing. Housing provides shelter, location, and privacy. And we should broadly allow housing, especially in places near jobs and amenities, and make sure everyone has access to it. So this is a fairly broad, I would think, value that some people might want to modify by looking at maybe privileging incumbent residents and their needs and wishes. But this is the way that I would like to approach this for this presentation. So coming back now to the central question, is what actually is a housing shortage? And it's not so easy as one might think to answer this. In some sense, supply and demand always come into balance at the price at which they do. And in that sense, there never is a shortage. They just adjust. But when we talk about housing shortages, we have something else in mind. And usually it's informed by these values that we add. And to understand what a shortage is, I want to focus on how do people adapt to shortages. So there are three main ways of how people do this. So if there's not enough housing, some people might go without housing. So you have visible or hidden homelessness. You have people that might move away or might not come into a specific region in the first place. So there's a migration response maybe. And lastly, people will move together or they will remain together. Say kids live with their parents longer, stay in roommates' household longer, live in other complex households. And the important part here is really this third one is the main response to a housing shortage. So on a regional perspective, homelessness numbers are, fairly low compared to overall housing need or shortage that we usually assess. If you think about CMHC's targets of 3.5 million homes above and beyond business as usual over the next 10 years, the majority of that is the shortage we already accumulated. That's a large number, much larger than homelessness, say. And at the national level, certainly we won't have much of a migration response. That maybe happens at the regional level. Really what happens is people double up. So just to think about how people double up, we often think about households and families as kind of being the same thing, but they're not. And it's just really important when we think about housing needs and targets and how do people double up? Well, we can look in the census and it gives us a lot of information about this. So we have adult children living with parents in red here. So what I'm showing is specific metro areas across Canada, not just in BC, by age group and their living arrangement. And I'm only showing the ones that don't live in what I would call a minimal household unit. So this would be, maybe sometimes we think of it as a nuclear family. So it's either an adult living alone, a couple with dependent children, or a single parent with dependent children. So we have a lot of households that are not of this form, and the share of the population living in them is shown here. It goes up for the younger age groups quite high, to about 30% in places like Vancouver and Toronto, and the 20 to 24-year-olds. And these living arrangements, we really should pay attention to. So the most common ones here, adults living with parents, it's something that declines quite dramatically. By the time people reach 30 or 40, these numbers get quite small. Multifamily households is something that we do see in specific age groups and regions. Living with relatives, similarly, is something that increases mostly with age, actually. And then there's also a complex household. So this will be things like a couple living with unrelated people, or a couple with children living with unrelated people in the same household. And what I really want to draw some attention to here is that the share of the population, while the overall patterns by age are quite uniform across metro areas, the overall levels of these are quite different. So if you compare Montreal, say, to Vancouver, we see that shares generally are much higher. And we'll look into this a little more now. So doubling up across Canada, I can just simplify this graph a little and just look at what's the share of the population that's doubled up overall. And we see these shares really varying quite a bit across metro areas. And looking at this, there's one obvious relationship one sees pretty much right away, which is rent levels. So if I want to plot this against rent levels and maybe add some more data, not just 2021, we had the pandemic, and there might have been pandemic effects messing with things. So I'm adding in here 2016 and 2011 for reference. We see the pattern is fairly clear. Higher rents means higher rates of doubling up, and that makes a lot of sense. People respond to high rents by doubling up. Most people don't move into housing they can't afford. They find other ways by pooling their income to make housing work. And going through this, we see this relationship is quite uniform across census years. The relationship between rents and doubling up. This is not something that is sort of just a recent thing. We do see that the range expands as we have higher shortages, we get more doubling up and also more rents, higher rents at the same time. The relationship itself is fairly similar. We do see these curves shifts rightward a bit, and this is mostly due to rising incomes over time. So rising incomes typically means people spend over time more money on housing, but ideally they get better housing services for that. That means they maybe get a nicer place, a larger place, in a place that fits their needs better. But it could also just mean that they spend more on the same type and quality of housing, if there isn't enough to meet demand. So this relationship is not perfect. We see there's quite a bit of variation around those best fit lines here. And next to income, we also have other factors that matter. For example, cultural acceptance of shared living arrangements. We've seen that in Metro Vancouver, we had a lot of multifamily households. And part of that is also due to just a different cultural mix that we have in our communities. And we can take this relationship and analyze it better and make it more complicated. At the end of the day, this relationship of rents to doubling up does not change much if we account for this. So I want to keep it simple here and just really focus on this relationship. So the bottom line really is a housing shortage, people doubling up, and high rents are closely linked. They're kind of the same thing. So if you want to figure out, do we have enough housing? We can just say, okay, well, how many people are doubling up? Or are rents really high? And looking at one of them really tells us about the other two. And that's the main takeaway I want to bring forward from this toward looking at housing needs reports and targets. So a couple of really quick takeaways. Doubling up and rents really provide a useful way to assess the impact of shortages. Another important one is we can't really improve housing outcomes without undoing shortages. So this relationship of doubling up in rents is really strong. If we lower rents, these people are still doubled up. It doesn't, if we have a magic way to just make rents lower, they're still doubled up. And we can't undo this. Another really important takeaway here is that households are outcomes of affordability. So what I mean by that is that household formation is really highly impacted, especially at the younger ages, between 25 and 35, really highly impacted by affordability. And if we look at household-based metrics, those are blind to this impact on household formation if we fix households. So we really have to be careful in how we measure impacts of shortages, and often rely on household-based metrics. For example, core housing need or breakdown of households by bedroom count or bedroom need. And these are useful to some extent, but we have to be really careful because they are biased or confounded by this problem that households and household formation is impacted. If people double up and pool their income, they might not be in core housing need, but they don't have good housing outcomes. Or maybe we can look at a concrete example here. A 30-year-old living with their parents probably lives in very affordable housing. The income of the 30-year-old plus the parents' income, they cover their housing costs. That's not really generally a problem. But if the 30-year-old chooses to move out, they may even be in core housing need. They may be quite stretched by housing costs. But if they choose to move out, they do so because they think it's better to do that than staying with their parents. Their housing outcomes have improved, but our metrics that we often use to measure this have actually not improved. So this is a complication that we have to be aware of when we're dealing with housing needs reports and targets. So there's a couple of caveats here. Undoing shortages can also trigger migration responses. So this is something that's especially important in high demand areas, not so much for maybe areas that are more rural or that aren't big pulls for population for in-migration. So inter-regional migration responses, though, if you look at how many people move to just a regional district, say Metro Vancouver, Kelowna, or Victoria, those are dominated by labor markets. Housing costs have some impact, but the main impact is really labor markets on those movements to metro areas. But within a metro area, migration response to housing can be quite strong. So if you build housing in one part of a metro area, that can really draw a lot of population there from within the region. So this leads us to the next point, that is that doubling up we've seen as maybe a really good proxy for housing shortages, but this operates at the metro level. And it's of limited use at the municipal level, where often we want to do those housing needs reports, because the place where people double up could be quite different from the place where they want to live or move out to. And that's a challenge when looking at trying to get this to the municipal level by looking at doubling up. Targets also needs to estimate future demand growth, and that is difficult. Population growth is endogenous to housing growth. So really what I mean by that is that especially within metro areas or within regions where we build housing, that determines a lot where population goes. So you can't just take population growth as an external quantity and then derive housing targets from that. The other one is income growth. Right? As income growth, that has important impacts on housing demand. Richer people consume more housing. They will live in bigger housing, and also they move out of their parents' place earlier or form households more readily. So that increases the number of units that you will have. So even if you don't have population growth and the population structure stays the same, if income growth, you will need to build more housing or affordability will worsen. And it's hard to really predict these things of how they will develop in the future, and they're I think we'll just have to bite the bullet and make some assumptions, some reasonable assumptions and ranges of what this might entail in the future. Okay, so how should we go and then do housing targets at the municipal level? If things like doubling up is not really all that informative, well, what is? Well, prices and rents still are. And we have to remember, prices and rents, they're information aggregators. They happen because a lot of people make choices about housing, and that is how rents and market rents and prices are set. And we can use that information to understand where people want to live, where demand is high, and where demand is not met by supply. But what does that mean, demand is not met by supply? They always meet at a price. But what we can look at is, what is the marginal cost of construction? What does it cost to, say, add a floor to an apartment building? The taller we build, the more expensive it gets to add a floor of housing, to add extra living space. But we can estimate that, of how much it costs to add a floor. And how much would this housing on that floor rent for or sell for? And if there's a difference between the two that's sizable, that's a clear indication of a shortage. So if we believe that housing is good, actually, we should probably strive and look for ways to get that differential to make that go away. And so CMHC actually did that work to estimate this wedge in 2019, or this is now for 2018, so it's fairly old data at this point. And I looked at what is the difference, like how much more does housing sell for than what it costs to build for new housing. And in Vancouver, that's about 90%. In Surrey, that's about 20%. So this is only select municipalities, and it's only select 1 year. But this is something that we could use more generally to understand shortages. Well, if we can see that there's a shortage of housing in Vancouver, the question is, then how do we turn these into targets? Or how do we turn this into estimates of housing need, of how many housing units are we short? And this question simply comes down to, well, how much more housing do we need to compete that difference away? We've seen in the previous graphs how rents and shortages of housing are related. And really what we want to do is slide down that graph. As we build housing, we reduce doubling up, and that reduces inevitably the rents, because people will only be able to move out and form their own households if rents actually lower relative to where they were before. Otherwise, they would have moved out already. Right? So that's the mechanism of how this works. And we have a range of estimates of how to do this. So CMHC has done estimates about the demand elasticity or supply elasticity of price. And we can do this for household formation too, and migration, and turn this around and then ask, well, how many housing units do we need to get back into that range? And here's an example of what these numbers from the previous slide would look like for Metro Vancouver. I had a little bit of a remark here that looked at, oops. Okay, my slides just, I don't know how to do this. But I looked at the marginal social cost of housing. And what does that mean? Well, the social cost means that there might be externalities of new housing. And typically what we do is we think about DCLs or DCCs that cover maybe some upfront cost of externalities of new housing, some infrastructure cost, and here maybe I left 10% of the cost on the table here as infrastructure cost when I do this estimate. And so that's also a values question of how much you want to charge up front versus how much you want to charge through property taxes over the lifetime of a building. But so here are some of those estimates, and they're quite sizable. So Vancouver right now, according to these estimates, is around 100,000 units short of housing. So that's significant. There's maybe 350 units of housing in Vancouver, in the city of Vancouver, just as an example. Now, looking at overall shortages is only one part of housing needs reports. The other part is, how do we ensure that people have access to housing? And that's quite tricky. So here's how I want to think about this. So if we undo overall shortages, that has impact through prices and throughout the housing spectrum. So what this does is it lowers prices and rents throughout the spectrum, and it shifts housing need in that regard. I also really want to emphasize here, when we think about undoing shortages and housing need, we really need to focus on housing as a system. We should not focus just on new housing. New housing is expensive, and most housing, though, is old housing. Most moves that people do are moves into old housing. If you ask around in your friend network how many people have moved into new housing, there's a lot of people that have never moved into new housing in their entire life. I'm certainly one of them. I've only lived in used housing so far. I've never lived in a housing unit that was new when I moved in. And this is really important because it tells us that what we should do is not focus on who the new housing is for, but what we should focus on is, what is the effect of undoing shortages on prices and rents of all housing, in particular old housing, because that is what most people move into. So looking then at the effects of undoing shortages is that it changes our housing need and how people interact with housing. So fewer people need non-market housing and cash subsidies once we undo the shortages, compared to if we just measure how things are today. On the other hand, undoing shortages increases household formation. So that means, like we've seen in the example of the 30-year-old moving out, we now have one new household, but that new household might now be in core housing needs. So it might perversely or paradoxically increase the need for non-market housing. And it speaks a little bit to how these metrics that we're using don't quite capture all these effects that we might want to see, don't capture all the benefits of adding new housing, because this 30-year-old is a lot happier. They chose to move out than they were when they lived with their parents, but we think housing got worse if we just look at core housing need. So the other problem that comes in here is that supply effects operate regionally. So if we undo shortages in one municipality, that also affects prices and rents in neighboring municipalities. So really, this is an effort that needs to be done together regionally and can't just be done by one municipality at a time. And again, we also have to account for effects, what happens in other municipalities, to understand how undoing shortages affects housing need in our municipality. So what would something like this look like? So we can look at, for example, here at distributional effects, where we run a scenario where we have in orange our actual housing needs. So this is for Metro Vancouver, of our actual housing needs. So this is the share of households on the left, or the share of people on the right, paying more than 30% of the income on housing, by housing need category, split up here. And we can see what happens, what things might look like if we actually undid our housing targets, undid our housing shortage, and hit our housing targets, the ones from the 2 slides ago. So what it shows is that there's a significant reduction in the people and households paying more than 30% of income on housing. But it also shows that we are far from zero. So this alone will not address the need for non-market housing or cash supports. So this is something that we need to still think about, how to incorporate that and how to make sure really everybody has access to housing. And this was it for my presentation. It was a little bit fast, and I apologize for that. and it was somewhat abstract in that it doesn't directly speak to the provincial requirements for housing. I have a bunch of links if people want to look into this in more detail, and I believe they'll be shared later or posted online in the PDF, and they're clickable. And so that gives some parts. And if anybody has questions today or later on, I'm always happy to engage in conversations, and there are various ways you can reach me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jens. You've actually shown us how much more complex the issue is than we originally thought. But it's good to talk about it. Stay on, turn off your webcam and your mic, but stay on, and we'll bring you back a bit later for the Q&A. Thank you again. And now I would like to invite Heather Cower to join us. Hi, Heather. Oh, you got to turn on your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
All right.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Heather Cower. I'm the Director of Community Planning for the City of Abbotsford, and I've been in this role for about 2 years, just like 2 days over 2 years. And my team is the one responsible for responding to the Housing Needs Report legislation. And in previous roles that I had, I was responding to housing needs reports through OCP updates and helping to, when the housing needs report legislation first came out, helping respond to that as well. So that's kind of my context. I'm going to talk a little bit about the past, present, and future of response to housing needs reports in the City of Abbotsford, and hopefully it will answer some of your questions. But there's a good chance that questions that you have are still questions I have as well, that we're all sort of looking for, and hopefully we can eventually help each other find those answers. All right, and I'm going to start here. So City of Abbotsford has been trying to address various aspects of housing for a while now. In 2011, Abbotsford adopted an affordable housing strategy. 2014 was a homelessness action plan. And we did a major OCP update in 2016 that included affordable housing policies, and then there were some updates to our housing needs documents, and including the housing needs report that we adopted that was received in 2021. So that's sort of the context for housing. Whoops, gotta remember how to do that. So in terms of policy, prior to 2016, the OCP had a lot of policies in it. And like many OCPs, some of those policies were aspirational, some of them were more action-oriented. The city made a deliberate choice at the time to really only have policies in the OCP that could reasonably lead to some action, but didn't necessarily cause action in and of themselves, if that makes sense. So this is an example here. So one of our OCP policies is about lock-off suites, and we thought we should support lock-off suites. But when what then happened is we updated our affordable housing strategy, and that had more specific kind of action to take regarding lock-off suites. And then we did an update to the zoning bylaw, which is really where the substantive action happens. Lock-off suites were then added as a use that was allowed in certain zones. This is typically how the city addresses any particular kind of action item. We start with a high-level policy at the OCP, and it gets implemented through different strategies or the master plans, that kind of thing. So when we get things like legislated things that we've got to do, like the housing needs report, we have to figure out how does that fit into our policy cycle. Maybe ideally our housing needs report is done first, and then we look at our affordable housing strategy based on that data. But as we all know, for those of us who are municipal planners, we know it doesn't always work like that in terms of our policy cycles. So this is sort of that timeline for how the city responded to the first round of housing needs legislation. In May of 2018, Bill 18 was passed, and that was, or it received third reading in May of 2018, but it wasn't enacted yet. And we knew that it probably wasn't going to be enacted until a regulation came out, and we didn't know when that was going to happen. So at that point, there's nothing for the city to respond to because nothing has been enacted yet. October, we have a municipal election, and at the city of Abbotsford, our city council goes into a strategic planning process. And in January of 2019, our council adopted a strategic plan that included initiating an affordable housing strategy update. So then in April of 2019, the Housing Needs Report legislation and now regulation came into effect, and we had more of an idea of what we would need to do around that. Because the affordable housing strategy update was already sort of underway, what we ended up doing is saying, okay, our housing needs report will be an implementation item of our affordable housing strategy. And so the housing strategy was adopted first, and then the housing needs report was adopted in 2021. And of course, even though it was adopted in 2021, it was based on the most recent census data, which was 2016. So, and just to kind of dive into the details of that legislation, and Bill 18, essentially, it required housing needs reports for the first time. We had to collect prescribed housing data in housing needs report for the purpose of preparing the housing needs report. We had to consider housing needs report when developing or amending an OCP, and we had to include statements and maps in an OCP with respect to housing units needed for 5 years. The prescription of housing data was going to come through regulation, but we didn't know what consider meant. There was no prescribed or guided standard for what consideration meant. And so I think for those of us who are working on OCP housing policy, we just sort of guessed at what that meant and did our best. And in terms of including statements and determining need was also kind of left to the local government to determine what the need was. So, and then of course the regulation came out, and it gave us the prescribed kinds of data to collect, and it provided a form that was a template for that report. What was also convenient at the time for those of us working on this was the fact that the province provided all of that data. So we didn't have to collect it ourselves. We simply got the download from the province and included it in a housing needs report. Most of the housing needs reports I've seen from this era are not just the template form. Most jurisdictions put together a more graphically pleasing document, but included all of those data sets. So in terms of our current timeline and present day, this is sort of the context for the current round of housing needs report updates. In January of 2023, our new council that had been elected in the year previous had adopted a strategic plan, and it included an OCP update as part of that plan. And at the time, we thought the OCP is just going to be a tweak. The 2016 had been a major update. There'd been a lot of work associated with that, and we didn't really anticipate a lot of changes in the new OCP. But then in April of 2023, the province released their Homes for People action plan, and that hinted at some things that might affect the scope of our OCP. We'll just say that, including small-scale multi-unit housing. Shortly after that time, we also started conversations with province around housing target orders. And in September of that year, our housing target order was received, and we were one of 10 of the first 10, the first cohort of housing target jurisdictions. The housing target order, in terms of resourcing and workload impact, was bigger than one might think. For us in particular, there were certain bits of data that were associated with that were not regularly collected. You know, our permitting system didn't identify how many bedrooms were in any particular unit, for instance. And so this housing target order ended up requiring us to update our building permit system. It also required us to do some work on past permitting, and we had permits that were still sort of being extended from 5 and even 10 years ago. So we had to go back through all of that building permit data and literally count numbers of bedrooms in units, because we hadn't had that data. So it was a big resourcing piece for us. And we started in on that. And then in November of 2023, Bill 44 came out. And of course, SMU was the big thing around that. And again, now there's another really big resourcing project that staff had to take on. And we had to have SMU adopted by June 30th of 2024. We had to change our zoning bylaws to accommodate 4 units per lot that previously only allowed 1 unit. And that applied to 22,000 lots in the city of Abbotsford. Excuse me. So Bill 44 also had the housing needs report updates. And we knew that was also going to be changing. We had some hints that there was going to be a methodology for calculating housing need that was maybe similar to the housing target order, but we weren't sure, and we wouldn't know until the regulation came out. And because we didn't have the regulation yet, despite the fact that there was a due date on that one as well, which was the end of 2024, we really had a lot to do already. And so we focused primarily Q1 and Q2 of 2024 on working on SMU. And then in June, the housing needs regulation amendments came forward. And then we got more of an idea of the work involved. And as those of you who are familiar with it know, the regulation actually has the methodology in it, the math associated with how you calculate need. Maybe mercifully, the province had partnered with UBC, and there was a calculator that was being developed, and we appreciated that, because I'm good at math, but there's like, I don't know, it looks like calculus to me. Anyway, I actually attempted to read through the regulation and do the math problems, and I was struggling with that. And then this seems a little like a side note, but we recently, in fact, I think it was last week, conducted a local point-in-time homeless count in the city of Abbotsford, and that was done through federal grant program. And I'll point out why that's important later. So that's sort of our current timeline in terms of how we are project managing and how we're managing our staffing resources to address the housing needs report. Again, the interim housing needs report is due by the end of 2024. And here's that mercifully part that the province said, look, you only need 3 things for this interim report, really. Number 1 is you need the number of housing units required to meet current and anticipated need for the next 5 to 20 years. And we're going to share with you what those numbers are. You also need a statement about the need for housing in close proximity to transportation infrastructure. And you need a description of the actions taken by the local governments since the last housing needs report to reduce housing need. This seemed more doable. And excuse me, as we started thinking about that, the first one on the list, housing need, again, we knew they were going to be calculated through the new methodology. The methodology was being captured by UBC in their calculator. And what we were also told was that these calculated tables could theoretically just be added as an appendix to your existing housing needs report, if that's kind of the amount of time you could devote to it. and then for these other two items, they could be either included in your housing needs report or, again, added as an appendix. And so we started asking ourselves, could we just take these three items and put those together and call it our interim housing needs report? But then we realized that the housing needs regulation still has other data in it. So, that original set of data that was required by the housing needs regulation, most of those data sets are still required and they aren't captured in the calculator. So, so we would have to either update our existing housing needs report with 21 data entirely, or something else. And so what we ended up doing, what we are going to be recommending to council, because this still hasn't gone there yet, is we're going to recommend taking our existing housing needs report, which, again, 2016 data. We're going to add an explanatory note to it, essentially, about this legislation, about the timing, and about why most of the data in this document is still 2016 census data, but that the calculator tables are not. We're then going to embed a statement about the transportation element. And for the rest, we are just going to add them as appendices. So the UBC tables, the list of actions we've taken, and because we have the data around the pit count results, we're going to also add those as an appendix. So that's our plan of action for the current time being. After the interim housing needs report, we're not done, because then we're really sort of gearing up for our OCP. So again, through all of this, we're still in the middle of an OCP update. The scope of the project has increased significantly, mostly due to SMU and responding to SMU. But we also need to respond to our housing needs report. And there's these kind of two items. One is we have to have statements and maps that demonstrate meeting the anticipated need for not just 5 now, but 20 years. And we also need to include policies to address each class of housing need in the regulation. Now, the word address, we have to have policies that address each class of housing need. Well, we don't have guidance yet on what addressing means. And so until we have that guidance, again, I see us sort of doing our best at guessing at what that means. And then class of housing need. The word class is not in the regulation related to housing need. And so what I'm assuming at this point is that the class of housing need is those items that are in the tables that are in the calculator. I'm missing a couple here, including the demand factor and the growth rate. But I'm assuming that the class of housing need are these items, and that addressing them in our policies and the OCP will be sort of up to us about how we do that. The demand factor, I appreciated Yen's presentation, because I actually think I understood it a little bit better now. But being able to explain it to our council is going to be challenging. Just putting that out there. once the OCP is updated and it's responded to the housing needs report and SMU, we're looking at the next round where we have to have a major update. Like, we have to completely do the housing needs report by the end of 2028. And there's some things to kind of consider in that. The next federal census is in May of 2026. And then that year, we're going to have a municipal election where our council will be putting together a strategic plan and hopefully have that available in January of 2027. But then all of the census data and the undercounts, if the timing is essentially the same as it was this last time, we might not have those numbers till the end of 2027. And so then we have a year, really, a year to be updating our housing needs report based on that new census data. And then the legislation has us checking our OCP and zoning bylaw to make sure they're consistent with those housing needs report numbers. And then we have to do that cycle every 5 years, which is a lot, which is new for us, right? That policy cycle that I was showing you before, that could be an 8-year cycle if you go OCP, master plan, strategy, zoning bylaw update. And we don't have 8 years anymore to respond to update our OCP. So some things to consider. And then, of course, as part of this update, we're going to have to think about where does our next affordable housing strategy update lie? We had already anticipated that we might be doing that after the OCP update. But if our housing needs report has 2016 numbers and 2021 numbers, what do we do with that? So we'll be facing those questions as we move forward. And that is my presentation. I feel like I also sped through it, but hopefully that gives us more time for questions.
Great. Thank you, Heather. We'll give you a moment to grab a glass of water if you need it.
Thank you. I know. Yeah.
Go ahead. Meanwhile, I'll invite Jens to turn on his webcam and his mic again, and we'll move right into the Q&A portion of our program. Just going to change this. We're all making a few adjustments. Okay. So we have some questions that were directed to Heather, some questions that were directed specifically to Jens, and then some general questions. And we will try and answer as many of those as we are able to in the time that we have left. So we'll begin with the first question to Heather. What about the effect of housing crisis on international students in Metro Vancouver? There was no specific policy for helping or supporting international students in housing needs reports. Is there any consideration for international students on the table?
Okay, so I guess I'll answer it first this way, in that, the housing needs report is a document that is mandated by the province. And this wasn't a category that they required of us to include. Of course, we can include other categories of data. And I think local jurisdictions could include this if they chose to do that. But that discussion about, what else do we include is really kind of a local discussion that you have with your elected officials. And it kind of speaks to what I was talking about before. Which document do you do that? We have the housing needs report, which is a collection of data, essentially, but you may have other documents in your community that speak to the bigger picture of housing. And for Abbotsford, that's our affordable housing strategy.
Okay. Great, thank you. And a similar question for Jens. What additional factors should local governments include in their HNRs?
Yeah, I think looking just more explicitly looking at prices and rents, I believe is really helpful, especially at the local municipal level, because this is something that really shows how local demand varies And it's tricky. The province added this demand factor, as Heather has mentioned, into the methodology for the housing needs reports, which is somewhat opaque in that it's just a number given by the province to um, the to the municipalities for the housing needs report. It's kind of like a fudge factor that says, well, we have all these things, but there's some things that this doesn't account for, and if you multiply by this, then we'll be better off, kind of thing. And so, yeah, I can really appreciate also what Heather was saying, that this is hard to explain to councils, but maybe relating it directly back to prices and rents and saying, look, in our region, or specifically in our city, compared to maybe the surrounding ones, rents are actually a bit different or higher, or there is an unmet need that is particularly high in our community compared to, say, a neighboring. So I gave the example between Surrey and the city of Vancouver. So there it's fairly clear that the demand is much, much higher, the unmet demand in the city of Vancouver compared to Surrey. So that would be, like, I haven't checked the demand factors, but I would assume that that is reflected in that.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. How are other regional districts compiling individual municipal HNRs into a regional housing summary document? Would you happen to know, Heather?
I don't know. I think in the Fraser Valley, I don't know if there's an effort in the Fraser Valley to do that. I think each of the local governments is doing their own, but I'm not aware of a regional collection of that.
Do you think that would be useful?
I do think that would be useful. At least having our collective information somewhere. But I'll put a caveat on that in the sense that somebody's got to do that work. And, you know, the value of this work, there's another question later on in your list about, you know, could the province have just given us all this information in the form of a report rather than having us do, you know, collect all of it and put it in a document and then receive it somehow, right? There's a resourcing issue with all of this that I think should be considered.
Agreed. Okay, moving on, unless Jens has anything to add.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a question that I see also next up for me, kind of coming up there, and I want to really echo that the efficiency of the province just doing it for everybody, that works, but it's very clear that it makes these things much easier, and the province does this to some extent by having now this online calculator. But I think there really is value for municipalities to sit down and think through their own housing needs. One problem is, as somebody who deals a lot with data, is, yeah, I can whip up these kind of general things and formulas and essentially scale this throughout the province. That's not a problem. But one does sometimes miss things. Local knowledge matters, right? And so for municipalities to look in and just first of all look at their own practices and seeing, well, where are actually ways where we kind of obstruct housing, maybe in ways that historically or for whatever reason happen to be that way, just to re-examine these things. That's I think one important part, to refocus on where maybe housing would be needed but isn't doesn't happen in whatever way. So how can more be enabled? But also look at the population and their specific needs, and at times then intervene and saying, hey, these methods that you have, these online calculators, they're great, but we have some local issues and we need to deal with them, and put that into those housing needs reports where maybe needs differ or don't fit that schema. And I hope the province is responsive to this. I believe there will be. But I do believe that municipalities looking themselves into this is an important step too.
Okay, thank you. Moving along on the same lines, how can cities make sure that these housing needs reports aren't just another report that sits on the shelf? We all know about those. Should they be dynamic and brief, or comprehensive and stable, less able to be adopted?
That's a really good question, because there's value in both. So it's one of those where going in depth sometimes is really nice, But I do believe that it would be good if some components of it could be sort of automated in a way that you can update them every year. And I would like to see something like some metrics that can measure progress. So if we're thinking about, I like to think about this in terms of our current housing shortage. If we think rents are too high, that probably means because we don't have enough housing. And so how can we undo those and say if it's measures of doubling up or the ratio of prices compared to construction cost or things like this, and monitor if we are actually making progress on these things. And that's something we can really do on an annual basis, and that can help do like the big picture things. But it's also important to go in depth sometimes and understand more specifically. So maybe the 5-year cycle for the in-depth is good, and then have earmark some of those things to be updated more regularly as data updates.
Okay. Heather, best approaches to consolidate with previous HNRs. I feel like you've sort of already answered this question based on your knowledge and your work. Do you want to add anything more?
Well, I will say, I think it would be best practice to be able to update it fully, with updated census numbers if you have the time and, everything. But yeah, things don't always work out that way.
Right. Okay. What if the StatsCan data is not online with local excuse me, with local government's own data? How should we approach that, Jens?
Yeah, so I think one major concern with StatCan data is that it tends to be always out of date by the time it comes out, right? The census, it's only every 5 years, but also it takes a year for the data to come out, almost, for the first data of it. And then the housing-related things, it's usually more than a year till that data comes out. And so similarly with demographic data, like population updates tend to be at least half a year out of date, if not like half to 1.5 years just for population estimates, or CMHC's data. So that is tricky, and local data can sometimes help to fill that gap. And so when they're adding in these other data sources is good, but it's difficult because each data source comes with their own quirks and their own issues of how it was collected. What are things to be careful about? For the census, we have the undercounts. We understand things reasonably well of how to operate with those things. But when we add other data sources, we need to do all that work again and see how they're compatible with other ones. So this is really tricky, I think. And I'm not sure what the best answer is, especially because the smaller communities for which this matters more are going to be under-resourced to do that work. It's not easy.
Okay, thank you. Heather, we'll go on to the general questions. So the first and the second question are similar. What additional factors should local governments include in their HNRs, and beyond the provincial requirements, what other areas of housing needs should municipalities incorporate? And you mentioned up-to-date data. Anything else that you can think of off the bat that would be useful? Jens, you can jump in here too if you have any ideas. Sorry, we'll go back to you, Heather.
Well, I think we've had some ideas around. Jens obviously, I think, had some good things to consider that the data doesn't necessarily reflect, and so I appreciated his presentation for that. There's anecdotal data that doesn't seem to fully fit into one of the categories that we've been given. One of the issues, and I'll give an example. One of the issues in Abbotsford is we have a lot of seniors we have more and more seniors who are at risk of becoming homeless because their rents are rising to beyond their income. And there just really is no place in the community anymore for them to rent. I think that's probably true across Metro Vancouver. And I don't know, how do we capture that specifically? I don't know that the required data sets necessarily do. And so it's things like that that I think should be captured.
Yeah.
Okay.
And beyond the census, this is really hard to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. How do we bake in contingencies for changing market conditions, demands in the future? Just like developers put a contingency on their projects, how do we do that with housing needs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we can't, like, there's no crystal ball to really say what the future will be, right? So one thing that the province has done is that in their targets legislation, they have sort of this 25% buffer in there where they will actually only spring into action if, like, your actual housing need, your targets are 25% lower than your actual housing need that they assign you in the targets. So you should strive, of course, to achieve your housing need there, but 25% is fairly sizable in order to allow for some of those things to go wrong. So at least the government or the province won't come cracking down on you if you don't exactly meet your housing needs. But this is something that is in a changing environment, and I think what's also happening is, in some sense, targets are a bridge, at least I view it this way, to where the province seems to be heading with asking for outright zoning to accommodate future housing need. In some sense, we don't need those targets, or they aren't that important anymore if we broadly allow housing. So if we move from the housing needs, and instead of saying, okay, how do we get this into the OCP, thinking, well, why don't we actually just zone for it and have clarity there? And I think that helps in a lot of ways. So yeah, it's a bit of a non-answer, but
Food for thought. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to this question because I feel it's very important. How should local governments integrate a DEI, decolonization, equity, and lens into their HNRs? They're all different, the acronyms. Heather?
If I can go first. I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is there's an Aboriginal Housing Association that has their own data around this, and they have specifically come to our council and I think have been going around the province asking the cities to include their data in our housing needs report specifically. And I think that's a pretty reasonable request. So that's one way we could do that. And they have indicated that those numbers being in our housing needs report are really important for them to be able to get grant money and to get funding for their projects.
Okay, thank you. The I is for indigenization, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay. Going on to Jens, is housing a long-term demand or a short-term?
I mean, housing itself is durable, right? So housing typically sticks around for a long time. If we think about demand from people, Canada is a growing population. Incomes have been growing, demand has been growing, and it will likely continue to grow. Who exactly demands the housing matters a little bit less in that sense, right? So I think we have a very strong case for continued demand growth in the future. So in that sense, I think we don't have to worry about housing not being used or being out of demand. There might be some economic shocks where there are some short-term fluctuations in things, but medium to long-term, I don't really see an issue there.
Okay, thank you. Do the HNR require addressing long-term solutions that include primary and secondary school education in each community about sustainable living and social well-being? Heather, would you like to try?
I mean, the short answer is no. And I want to.
And how do you feel about that as a planner in a fast-growing community?
Yeah, I mean, this has been this has been a lot of the discussion around around SMU is, yes, we've got to allow the zoning for everything. And yes, we can say that we need all this housing, but what about the infrastructure around it? What about the social infrastructure? And I don't have a good answer for it, but it's definitely on our mind all the time as we're looking at these regulations.
Jens, anything to add?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the housing needs reports are really focused on housing in a sense. They don't do everything, but to think around infrastructure, social infrastructure, but also other physical infrastructure is a really important part of planning. You know, I think it's probably the core. The core of planning is how do we get the infrastructure in place to support the growth of our communities? And so it is sort of the next step that has to follow on a housing needs reports that says, well, okay, we have all these people that want to live here. And one thing we really should remember is that the growth in housing is different from growth in population, right? In many cases, what we're talking about here, especially at the national level, is about enabling people to live in their own household, to form their own households, right? So a big part about undoing the housing shortage is to allow people to not double up and live in their preferred living arrangements, not maybe in a roommate households in their 30s. And so that doesn't add population. It does redistribute where they live, though. So we don't add poopers, say, if we allow households to split up, but they might poop in different places, and that has different impacts on our infrastructure. But we need to remember that a big part of undoing our shortage really is just redistributing our existing population better. And so we don't need a new community center or a new school. There is an issue, though, if one school is full and the other one is empty because of, as a consequence of this. So this still needs thought, but we need to think this through from, you know, more generally. Say in Vancouver, we've seen the low-density neighborhoods emptying out since schools closing, right? So there, SMU is sort of like it's a rescue. It's rescuing the existing infrastructure from becoming obsolete.
Related to that too, there's also in some cultures, it's actually desirable and expected that the children will remain at home until they're a lot older, and they all sort of band together and help each other out. So how do you account for that? And especially in Vancouver, there are a lot of neighborhoods where this is very prevalent.
Yes. So two things to that question. So we definitely see this, and this is very true, and it is generally understood that there are different levels of acceptance for shared living arrangements. And if we look in the data, what we see is that for first-generation immigrants, they don't double up as much, partially because they don't have these existing networks, like they don't have parents to move into their place, right? So for second generation, it's really where we see it. By third generation, it's kind of washed out. We're all Canadian at that point. But we do see these variations there. But it's really important to understand that at the same time, a lot of these groups have lower incomes. And we need to distinguish how much of that is driven by just lower incomes and people doubling up because of that versus a cultural affinity. So just because we see higher rates, actually the majority of those higher rates is due to lower incomes. And so that is not, just because we see those discrepancies, it's not a cultural preference. It is an economic necessity. And so there's still some cultural preference left. So it's not like that's not a thing. It is a thing. But so when I showed these kind of graphs, I alluded to that being there. But the main relationship and the strength of that relationship really is not that much impacted by this.
Heather, anything to add?
No, that's all good information, I think.
Okay. And I want to thank Barbara Everdeen for clarifying diversity, equity, and the I's for inclusion. And I did know that. I just had a momentary brain lapse. Thank you, Barbara, for clarifying that. Going on, what are the key items municipalities need to implement meaningful change once they have their HNRs? Again, what do we do we don't want to put this plan on the shelf. We want to actually implement it. How do we do that, Heather?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we now need to ensure that our land use designation maps and our zoning maps have the zoning in place, I think those are important and are responsive. How we do that is going to be important too. You know, we can have a zoning map that would allow for all the units, but that in and of itself isn't going to take into account the age of the housing, you know, like what's actually going to get redeveloped over that 20 years. And so the analysis of that needs to be more refined than just a blanket zoning map. So that's one thing. And, you know, a recognition that housing is not, is a complex issue, especially if you have homeless folks in your community. They actually need more than just housing. They need other kinds of supports. And you need resourcing to do that. And you need, for the city, and one thing that comes to mind is the fact that we have a whole department or division, let's say a handful of people who are staff who are devoted to that issue. And to the extent that cities can prioritize resourcing to address that issue, I think that's how you do it. Otherwise, you are in danger of that document just sitting on a shelf.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there elements you feel are missing from the current HNR methodology or could be expanded upon to better equip municipalities, Jens?
Again, I'm hoping that we can sort of move more toward a price-based metric, just because I think at the municipal level especially, that is just more relevant. And it's just very hard to use population-based methods as we're doing right now, demographic methods at the municipal level. So this is something that, you know, maybe the province will move toward doing. I think they're not going to change up methods fast. We have been a lot of changes already. We need some stability in this process, and but I think that's something that is good looking into over the longer term, and hopefully incorporate in meaningful ways.
Okay. How should HNRs inform decision makers regarding municipal planning and zoning policies? And Heather, I know you alluded to this about trying to tell your council, you know, everything that they need to know in a way that they can understand it. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I don't know that I have anything more to add to that much. I mean, really, it is about our OCPs and our zoning bylaws at this point.
Jens, anything?
No, I think that's right. And I would really stress, as much as possible, implement it into the zoning bylaw. It cuts down on work further down the road too. So it's actually good. It, you know, gives certainty to people who live somewhere. They kind of know what's on the books then, and the same for developers. Certainty is good for everybody. I like to also say that maybe something like discretionary zoning or things that still have to go through many processes where there are stop points. It's sort of a fertility drug for people opposing things. We want to remove some of those and have robust discussions on the big picture items, not on a project by project basis. That's just not very productive. It doesn't help anyone, I believe. And the other part, though, that I think we need to focus on, and that's really on planning to figure out what will actually happen when we zone more broadly, right? Because planning still needs to figure out, well, we now allow all this housing, but where's it going to go? What is actually likely to happen? And Heather already alluded to, well, in some places, maybe there's some nice new buildings, they're not going to get redeveloped. So we can allow housing there, but it's not going to do anything. So, but figuring out then where housing might land helps us to plan for social infrastructure, for sewage, for these other things. And that's something that is still important work that needs to be done.
Should you build the infrastructure first or the housing first? In tandem, what's the
So,
answer?
I mean, I'm not a planner, so I'm probably the worst person to ask. But one thing that I would say here is that development happens generally slowly. This is not something that happens overnight. So there tends to be some time to react to. So you want to be as proactive as possible. Typically, maybe just because it wastes money if you don't, right? If you dig up a sewer line and then a year later you come back and think, oh, we need a bigger one, that just wasted a lot of money. Or if you build a community center in some place and then nobody actually goes there, that also wastes money. So it's a bit of both, where you want to kind of wait and see what happens and be a bit nimble and try to be as adaptive as possible. But it's hard with planning, where there's sometimes big capital investments that have to happen.
Mm-hmm. Heather, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a scenario where you can really build the infrastructure first, because you're paying for the infrastructure as the development goes. You know, we're relying on the development community more and more to help pay for the cost of that the infrastructure that their development is causing. But you know, we are undergoing kind of let me say this. With our OCP, we have developed a clunky, I will say a clunky forecasting model for where we think development will go. And I think that, and we're going to be working more on that model and how we get better at that, at forecasting where development will go. I know that there are some, municipalities who've developed some tools for that. Hopefully we can get better at predicting where the infrastructure goes so we can better resource it.
Okay. What are your thoughts about meeting our housing goals while also meeting our emission reduction goals? And that's something we haven't really talked about, transit-oriented development. Can anyone discuss that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So, right. So one thing that we're doing here is, when we're adding housing, a big question is, where does the housing go, right? So emissions is something that happens where we have to think about, of course, ongoing emissions, that operational emissions, and that's something that we regulate fairly well through building code now. We have embodied emissions that when we build something, there are different carbon intensities of doing so. But also there's the question of, where do we build it? Do we build it on greenfield? That has other secondary effects, and transportation and other emissions that happen just from living in different locations. So generally we know that living in well-located centrally areas means that, counting all these emissions together, a family living in those, say, a concrete tower in a well-located neighborhood will have lower overall emissions than somebody who lives in greenfield, single family further out, even though embodied emissions are lower. So those are things that I don't see how these two things are at odds, but it's something that we need to figure out how to do this. And one other big caveat is that we want to make sure that the new housing that we build is economically viable. By which I mean that it shouldn't just remain there because zoning holds it in place. So in Vancouver, I've actually a paper on this in building and environments that looks at the carbon impact of the teardown cycle in the city of Vancouver, where single-family housing gets turned over at increasing rates. Well, we now have 30-year-old buildings that get torn down and rebuilt. And the issue there is that the housing in really central parts of our region of just low density is not economically viable. As soon as you allow higher density housing there, it'll get torn down in a heartbeat. And that's just a strategy that leads to a lot of waste and emissions that really don't need to happen. So we need to think more about, are these buildings that we are forcing or allowing economically viable so that they can outlive the full life of a building. And that's one other way of how housing specifically can address this.
And many buildings that look like single-family homes actually may house 4 or 5 different households. And if we knock them down, then we're getting rid of that affordable housing. So are we really helping? No comments on that?
Well, I mean, I think it depends, right? So there are definitely homes in Vancouver, houses in Vancouver that are very well used, and they might get replaced by something that really is marginally not housing a lot more people, and that's probably counterproductive.
Yeah, and
So
will they be affordable too? I mean, I think that's the key, not just how many units replace the affordable housing, but will they be affordable?
yeah, I think the tearing down older homes that are already fairly dense is probably not very less productive than saying tearing down lower density housing and rebuilding it there. So that generally is a better strategy. So we've done this a lot. Metrotown is a shining example of that, where we have replaced old rental housing with new, much higher density housing, and left single family neighborhoods just across the street untouched. And that's probably the wrong priority from a climate perspective as well as from an affordability perspective. And at the same time, though, we want to make sure that when we think about affordability, it's not really the affordability of the new units that is the important factor here, right? Housing is a system, and affordability is a property of the system, not of a particular unit. Right? When we don't keep up with our housing supply, and the housing supply doesn't keep up with demand growth, the result is that old housing filters up. It becomes more expensive. Rents go up in old housing. We've seen this a lot, right? What we want to do is reverse this. If we catch up and more than make up for old housing, for the housing demand by adding new housing, old housing filters down. It's how it used to be in times when we built more housing, where old housing over time becomes accessible to lower income households. It's just, but again, it's a property of the system. And so it's difficult because there's a trade-off on a unit basis. And I think a really important part to focus on is displacement, direct displacement. And it does happen, compensation. But I wouldn't worry so much about the affordability of the new units.
Okay. How should housing needs reports inform the land development process before housing construction begins? What is the stage of planning where housing needs assessments should be operationalized? So in other words, at what point do we include the development industry in our housing needs planning? Heather?
I mean, ideally, we are getting their feedback continually, whatever stage of development we're doing, or whatever stage of visioning we're doing, whether it be the housing needs report or the OCP, that the development community is given an opportunity to weigh in on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think having general feedback from the development community is important, but I would say we should involve them less in a sense, where I've seen it in the past where, for example, we have community plans where developers have huge impact on actually designing the communities. I would think that's something that really is in the public interest and the public should do, and actually do the work on those OCPs, and then sell off or designate specific parcels for development in certain parameters, instead of having a developer master plan sort of a little mini community within a city. And that just strikes me as not the right approach to this. As we've been offloading a lot of the planning work onto the development community, and yeah, I just don't think we should.
Okay, interesting. Two opposing views.
No,
I will leave it
different
at
parts
controversy.
of the I don't think we were opposing either, but
I don't think we're opposing.
No,
Yeah.
not opposing, but just different on the spectrum, different ends of the spectrum, which is interesting, very interesting. And I really appreciate your candor on answering these questions very honestly. Thank you both. I'm looking at the time, it's 1:31. I think it's time to end it. We could go on and on. There were so many questions, but I did want to say thank you to our speakers today, Heather Kraar, Jens van Bergman, And I also wanted to provide a shout out to Kristen Agnello for actually putting the panel together and all her hard work on the PLN initiatives to date. She's done a tremendous job trying to make sense of this whole this everything new, all this new information that we've been getting from the ministry and all the new requirements. So thank you, Kristen. I know she did log on, so I don't know if she's still on. But if you need more information on any of this that we talked about today, please visit www.pibc.bc.ca/PLN, the PLN resource section of our website. And once we download this recording and process all the presentations, we will also add those onto this website. And you're welcome to go and get any type of information that you need. So thank you again to both our speakers, and we will end it here. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks, Sophie.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.